This is Mark Williams. I'm going to be presenting to you a new essay that I've written on the relations between Jews and Christians. This is the fourth in a series of essays on aspects of Judaism. And I've been looking at Judaism from a Christian perspective off and on in different ways for about the last 7 years. And this essay summarizes some of what I've come to in terms of a basic conclusion as to Judaism's value, particularly for Christians. The title of the essay is Joined at the Hip, but Too Seldom Elsewhere. Can such a couple, who was once conjoined but never married, once in love but chronically estranged, ever be reunited as a union that was originally demanded by God? This question, occasionally simmering in both synagogues and churches in recent years, had lain dormant since the early centuries of the Catholic Church, which made strenuous efforts to hasten and render steadfast this estrangement between Jews and Christians, preferably forever. Being argumentative partners in the ways of their shared monotheistic God, Jews and Christians have rarely agreed on much of anything, except that Jesus Christ necessarily mattered to them during those formative years of the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, and indeed some called themselves Jewish Christians. Even this eventually attenuated hybrid came only after the long evolution of Judaism itself over perhaps 1,500 years from the time of Abraham, particularly its sense of what a Mashiach or Messiah could be. It is this messianic conception that came to be either a divisive wedge or a shared aspiration between Jews and Christians, which served as the original bond or stumbling block to any lasting partnership with which God might have been at all pleased. In 3 previous essays, I looked at various aspects of Judaism from an outsider's perspective. A brief history of their faith, including its pagan origins and practices, Pharisaic spiritual envy of Jesus, the psychology of Jewish identity, as well as Jews' entrenched resistance to accepting Jesus as their Mashiach. I have come to the unpleasant conclusion, despite its complexities and my admiration for its tenacity in the face of far too much adversity, that at its center, Judaism remains too spiritually hollow. This is not to say that for Christians, Judaism has no value. On the contrary, the 1st century CE Jewish religious milieu remains very important in understanding Jesus in terms of both the tradition he represented as well as how he chafed against its limitations. It was Jesus himself who provoked both schism and later courtship, both between Jews and together with Jews and Gentiles. He wanted to take his Judaism somewhere other than where it was, toward a spiritual realm unknown to anyone else who had ever lived. That has always been why he matters. In this essay, I want to broaden the picture to look further at both sides of this courtship and later discuss how Christian churches could incorporate at least a rudimentary interest in Judaism into their worship services. When I left church 10 years ago, I had grown tired of what is usually called white bread Christianity. Too many abstractions lacking real context, and though not thinking about it then, I only knew the phrase, the ancient Israelites. Who were these people, anyway? Long before this fraying courtship ever existed, there were what the Jews called messianic expectations. These ideas, drawn from the Tanakh, or Old Testament, described a sort of manly warrior king who would preside over at least the Jews, if not the entire world, be a great political leader and perfect teacher of the Jewish law. Other characteristics included a male descendant of David, 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and 13, drawn from the tribe of Judah, Genesis 49:10, and born of human parents without divine fatherly conception. He would gather the Jews back to Israel, Isaiah 11:12, and rebuild the temple, Ezekiel 37:26-27, even though the first temple had not yet been destroyed. He would usher in an era of world peace, Micah 3:4-3. There would be a general resurrection of the dead, Isaiah 26:19. How much all of this was understood by the general Jewish population is unclear, at least to me. What is clear is that because of long-standing Roman oppression, the Jews were seeking someone who would improve their lives. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24-27 described a more exacting scenario. 483 years after the destruction of the original temple and a proclamation to rebuild it, quote, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, would bring forth such a messianic figure. All of this had been circulating long enough for the Jews to clarify what sort of Savior they sought, and certainly informed the religious prejudices of the Pharisees and Sanhedrin, mainly Sadducees, during Jesus' lifetime. The weight of their own tradition sat firmly on the shoulders of these clergymen once he began to present, quote, an alternative version of what they had understood and cherished. The psychology of having a certain perspective cannot be emphasized too much here. These Jews knew nothing that was any different. It had helped them to survive so much in their troubled history, and no amount of fancy miracle making would likely turn their faces toward any novelty of the new. Into this bitter-tinged, half-hopeful Jewish posture, Jesus stepped as supposedly one of their own. He had been born in the shadow of the despised Herod the Great's death, the last of the significant Jewish kings, corrupted by his own megalomaniacal rantings, the Donald Trump of his day. What all four Gospels, especially John's, portray is what I would call Jesus' perpendicular spirituality toward his Jewish brethren, confusing and outguessing them time and again until their rage overwhelmed any sense he might have anything useful to offer them. Nor did they consider that he might be any reflection of divine purpose. Quote, if this man were not from God, he could not do anything. John 9:33. We know that Jesus never fully persuaded anyone for the long term, despite his teachings, parables, and miracles. His disciples grew worn out, the crowds less appreciative, and so the clergy's plotting finally took shape. This was not the warrior king of generational legend, and the later mocking reflected their disappointment that no recognizable Savior was coming. We all know what happened soon enough, and I have grown to dislike that Catholic sentiment of Good Friday, when everything collapsed and maybe God thought he had made his worst ever mistake. The Sanhedrin and Pontius Pilate had gouged, quote, the first wound that never really healed, when death and resignation clouded the air with Jesus' spiritual royalty lost to all the now garbled expectations of mere mortals who had never truly seen God in the first place. Then came the beginning of the, quote, second wound. Even though the Jews, with Saul overseeing, stoned Stephen early on, with Jesus physically gone despite his surprising resurrection, the Jerusalem Council's decision to allow Gentiles to be spared circumcision, and the law never really settled anyone's concerns, just as the Council of Nicaea nearly 3 centuries later would not truly relieve Christianity of all its heresies. There was the endless problem of no Jesus in the flesh, which not only spawned what we would call theological conspiracy theories, but steadily whittled down the fragile Jewish community to its survivalist core. I have recently read books by two Jewish academics who do not understand that John's use of, quote, the Jews in his gospel refers to his frustration over being turned out of the synagogues for their belief in Jesus as Mashiach and not some disparagement of Jews generally. Thus, within 60 to 70 years of his death and resurrection, with the Second Temple destroyed and Jews scattered to the diaspora, Jews and Christians were already dissolving their courtship on the grounds of spiritual incompatibility, serving as their own lawyers, and both sides claiming God as the prevailing judge. The second wound refers to all that would befall Jews over nearly 20 centuries: Christian hostility for, quote, killing Jesus, persecution from many quarters, and eventually the Holocaust or Shoah. It is this wound that still flushes the skin of Jews almost from the moment that any Christian speaks to them of religious matters. It is an inherited wound too often rebruised or even lacerated again yesterday and tomorrow. It is also Jews' reflexive defense designed to keep Christians at bay and not to have to look at their own actions along the way. But first, what actually happened? Early Christians did indeed blame Jews for Jesus' death, to the point of discouraging their brethren from associating and eating with or marrying Jews, as well as forcing Jews to convert to Christianity if they had any real interest in Jesus, thus having to abandon their cherished Jewish heritage. Passover and Easter became estranged by dates to reflect the worsening schism. Justin Martyr ridiculed the Jews with his book, Dialogue with Trypho, circa 160 CE, for being, quote, superstitious. The early Catholic clergyman John Chrysostom gave 8 lengthy homilies in 386-87 in Antioch to chastise his parishioners from attending Jewish festivals out of fear that they might, quote, convert. He also discouraged circumcision, clearly blamed, quote, pitiful and miserable Jews for killing Jesus, and repeatedly referenced scripture from various Old Testament prophets to fortify his claims against the Jews. Chrysostom referred to synagogues as, quote, dwellings of demons, and that Jewish law was now, quote, fruitless. He was later venerated by the Orthodox Christian Church nonetheless, and remains admired as a church father. Martin Luther eclipsed Chrysostom with his venom-drenched 65,000-word 1543 treatise on the Jews and their lies, which served as a blueprint for Adolf Hitler to terrorize the German Jews for years prior to the start of World War II. Luther advocated active retaliation against the Jews, including destroying their homes, seeing them as spiritually hopeless. This diatribe is so repugnant that it shrivels Luther's reputational value, given that it was written only 3 years before his death. These two theologians became influential in this regard, and Jews today will quickly reference them in defense of their own survival. Frankly, the Catholic Church has done itself too little favors over the centuries in this regard, including their moral slackness during the Shoah or Holocaust. Holocaust, after all, means, quote, burnt offering. What does all this mean for we Christians in the 21st century? What is the relation between the, quote, first and second wounds? Jesus' perpendicular spirituality was likely going to prove too corrosive for the Sanhedrin to tolerate him for the longer term, and so they used their collusive relationship with Pontius Pilate to have him arrested on sedition charges. We must remember that the Romans were hypervigilant during Jewish festivals like Passover for signs of trouble, so despite the Gospel's portrayal of Pilate in kinder terms, he would have been paranoid about civil strife and possibly being ordered to Rome to explain himself. His brutality against the Jews was otherwise well known, which resulted in his dismissal in 36 CE. I will shrink the complicity over Jesus' death down from the general Jewish population to the Sanhedrin, which reflected the ambivalent rancor and admiration of Jesus from the much larger group of Pharisees, which Josephus said numbered perhaps 6,000 clergymen. It is Caiaphas from which we hear in the Gospels during their examination of Jesus, and it is his decision to turn Jesus over to Pilate for crucifixion, as we all know Caiaphas's famous speech about sparing his fellow Jews from Jesus in John chapter 11, verses 45 to 53. It is thus the situational and religious melding of Caiaphas and Pilate that secured Jesus' death at Golgotha. These two men, and not 10 to 15% of the entire Roman population at the time. If we ask Jews today how Jesus got killed, they will answer Pilate, which is technically true. If we ask them how they know this, generally having not read the gospel accounts themselves, they would simply stare at us. Jews do not read the Gospels not only because their history has discouraged them from doing so, but because they know the answer, Caiaphas. Without him, Jesus would not have died. So, mostly one man, not an entire people. Let us finally say this out loud to begin to heal these two wounds. The Catholic Church punished the Jews in subsequent centuries by rendering them spiritually impotent and guilt-ridden, as described above. The courtship had gone completely in the ditch and would remain there until our own lifetimes, when the Messianic Jewish movement began to sprout. Replacement theology, or supersessionism, is not that the Catholic Church replaced the Jews in God's covenant, but rather it was Jesus Christ who would inspire Gentiles to relinquish their tired paganism to find someone wholly new and masterful. He lived and died in the house of Israel, and so, in that sense, we owe them and him everything. There is no theology like a living man who walks, teaches, heals, and performs miracles to be witnessed in the flesh day after day. Since he was Jewish, that is fine. Let us all have him as we can for our own nourishment every day. So, some suggestions for Christian churches. The simplest thing, call Jesus Yeshua, his Hebrew name, which means salvation, more than once in a while, to pry him out of our white Anglo-Saxon prejudice that he was born speaking English and lived in New Jersey. Find a Jew who can play the shofar or trumpet to use in announcing the opening of services, or if unavailable, use YouTube. Jews could be invited to deepen congregants' understanding of either their festivals or Yom Kippur. If unavailable, use volunteers within churches to present such material. Jewish aspects of Jesus' parables are sometimes also interesting, particularly concerning relevant local agriculture. Jews could be invited to Sunday school classes to simply describe their religion and answer questions. Even in our corrosive climate, this would still be possible if done hospitably, as Jews love to instruct Gentiles about their religion. Psychologists call this contact theory, when the persons of our prejudices are even slightly befriended for mutual benefit. Jewish sermons might be something for later on. For the Jews, since this is to be a renewal of courtship, the best place to start would be to grit their teeth and read both Matthew's and John's Gospels in that order. The opening genealogy in Matthew's Gospel always attracts Jews, and the teaching episodes feel more familiar. John's Gospel travels to spiritual places that the synoptics cannot even fathom, so this is a must. Jews could then read Paul's major letters to better understand how the Gentiles came to be involved in the first place. Many Jews accept Jesus as their Mashiach and do so after reading the New Testament as encouraged by Christians. So the old Jewish admonition against our proselytizing them gets disobeyed, also for mutual benefit. More adventurous Jews could familiarize themselves with the basic aspects of the Shroud of Turin from books, the internet, or watching films like Silent Witness or The Real Face of Jesus. Another great film is Jesus of Nazareth from 1977, the 6-hour Franco Zeffirelli masterpiece that I have watched umpteen times over the years. Jews possibly visiting Catholic churches might be useful just to see what the other partner is doing. Lastly, my own sense of the state of religion and spirituality in our current world. According to the Atlantic magazine, 40 million Americans have stopped attending church in the past 25 years. People are voting with their curiosity's feet to pursue what feels necessary and shedding what does not. Church attendance, week after month after year, tends to be an overly passive activity with familiarities and redundancies abounding. Denominational strife, both within and between Protestant sects, is bad advertising for churches already losing parishioners anyway. The quote, gay issue has made churches look ignorantly irrelevant to the lives of homosexuals, and like the Catholic Church's sex abuse scandal, its stain may well be permanent. The Christian church is now on the other side of where it was in the burgeoning first century, and its decline, with some 80 closures every week, is not pretty. Jews are too often overly secular, even in Israel, and half of them are marrying outside their faith, so the biggest threat to Judaism's long-term survival is now intermarriage. Atheism has become fashionable, particularly among younger, well-educated males who think science is the best idol with which to finally slay God. I call atheism the kindergartner's religion because its bad ideas always remain possible if only unto them. Jesus never existed. There are multiple universes out there if only we could find them. The existence of God can never be proven, and the Bible is a set of fairy tales told to fools who will believe anything. Such is our world. The heyday of full churches with generations of ready believers is largely gone. And yet, the popular television series, The Chosen, eases our pervasive spiritual hunger in its more three-dimensional portrayal of Jesus and his first century Jewish milieu. It has been said there will be no second coming of Jesus Christ until at least the majority of Jews accept him as their Mashiach. As they were slaves in Egypt for between 210 and 430 years and wandered in the desert for 40 years, we Christians have awaited Jesus' return to earth since at least 33 CE. No other Mashiach is forthcoming, but Jews have remained indifferent to God's will in this regard. Is this not what anti-Semitism is all about? Christians do not blame today's Jews for Caiaphas, though we do fault them for continuing to reject God's will in its most manifest embodiment through ushering forth this miraculous man-God for our salvation. It is clear that Jesus is more and yet different than all the centuries of Jewish speculation about their Mashiach as described in the Tanakh. In saying this, I am not anti-Jewish, but rather clear-eyed. Ask the Messianic Jews, because they know all about this sudden truth of spiritual completion from gaining Yeshua. Jesus Christ, as our Mashiach, belongs to God, both before and after he ever belonged to any of us. We Gentiles were never, quote, dogs. A lack of spiritual curiosity is never a good calling card unto God, and none of us should want to remain perpetual prisoners to either our own or other people's histories. So this one guy is still left, and he, along with his divine Father, is always watching us with their daily message. You never created yourselves, so whom or what else shall you worship besides us? Surely by now you know we never persecuted any of you, so be glad and hold hands. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in any of my other essays, you're welcome to visit my website, which is entitled everydayeaster.com. I also have 2 books with both essays and other Christian material. My first book's entitled Once Every Day Becomes Easter, and the second book is a book of essays, including the first 3 of these Jewish essays. It's entitled Our Gifting Eclipse.